Welcome to Santa Barbara Talks with Josh Molina. It's really a pleasure today to be here with Dick Flacks, who is a longtime UCSB professor of sociology. And, he retired a few years ago, but very well known still, very well respected in the community. And obviously, as a reporter, I've read about him and known about him over the years. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation because Dick's got a lot to say, and he called me out on one of my stories recently, and I actually enjoy that, and I'm looking forward to having the conversation here about it. Dick, how are you today?
I'm greatly appreciative of the fact that you invited me on, and I do have a lot to say about some of these things right now, so I feel eager to talk.
Okay, all right, well, let's dive right in. I recently wrote a story about an issue at the Santa Barbara City Council where they were talking about a rent cap, an increase on the amount that a landlord or property owner could increase rents. And the cap was 2% at the time that I wrote about it. And I didn't know if CPI was involved or not, eventually became involved. Obviously, this is an issue that property owners and landlords opposed. Tenants and activists were in favor of. I kind of wrote it with a tone of why now, why in December, why as Kathy Murillo, the mayor, is leaving, why not earlier? I sort of, suggested that it was a little bit political and why not bring it up sooner, blah, blah, blah. And you, Dick, you called me out and said, hey, let's have a deeper conversation about this. So let's do this. What is your take on this proposal to cap the rents?
Well, the thing that Josh, that I was calling you on was that it wasn't a new issue, and that Megan Harmon on the council and Kristen Snedden, they had actually proposed raising this more than a year ago, and had a little paper they issued about that. I think the shots here were called largely by Cause, which has been the lead organization in organizing tenants and in advocating for tenant rights. And they wanted, initially, they didn't go for the rent stabilization priority because they really think the priority at that time was to prevent unjust evictions and to provide more support for tenant rights. But rent stabilization is part of what they're calling community stabilization. And that's their framing, I think, in this town because of the draining away of working class and minority people, families and people from the community that's very noticeable demographically. That's what I think largely I mean by community stabilization. Can we keep our neighborhoods together? Can keep our communities, working class people together in this town, given the costs of housing? That's what they're raising. By the way, I'm a member of the Cause Action Fund board, and that's part of where I get my education on some of these things. I'm also chair of the SBCAN, Santa Barbara County Action Network organization, been going for about 20 years, that I helped to create here, and it's countywide. So both of these groups have been very active on the tenant issues, housing issues. So anyway, the take is, well, yes, so that it is a little confusing right now. The state adopted a cap, the state legislature, and this is pretty unusual, that because rent control has been really not just controversial issue, but an issue that's largely been in disfavor in respectable economics circles for many years, that it supposedly doesn't work, that it's a disincentive to developing housing that's needed. Those are basically two arguments about it that have come, constantly been used. So nevertheless, in the midst of the pandemic, as a way of giving some relief to tenants, the legislature adopted a 5% cap on rent plus the cost of living. I don't think anyone in the legislature realized that the cost of living index would be up over 6% in itself. So we're actually, the state law, which is supposed to cap rent, you could say it's now authorizing 10% or so rent increases. And that in itself creates even more of a, I think, crisis in terms of this situation. So what Kathy and Oscar Gutierrez were putting on the table at the council was, you're right, initially, I think a proposal for a 2% cap, or whichever is higher, or the cost of living index. What she was saying, the mayor, at the hearing was, why don't we say it's both together? That's the cap, which is similar to the state rule, but with a lower percentage increase allowed. So I listened to most of that hearing, which was not a pleasant experience, but you know, a lot of people talked from the mom and pop landlords come out when these measures are put up. I was actually feeling we were all blessed by the fact that this was on Zoom, because in the past, when these kinds of things come up, the council chambers, and you I'm sure remember these things, hugely packed by supposedly mom and pop landlords. I say supposedly because I'm sure there were people with larger holdings in the audience too. And that creates a kind of atmosphere where calm discussion isn't so easy. Oddly enough, the Zoom thing, it was pleasantly boring because it wasn't super, you know, passionate and dramatic and filled with boos and hisses and all the rest of it. So anyway, I listened to that, so I'm aware of at least the arguments made during that session. We can talk about some of that, because I think it was a good thing. Personally, I think, I'm not sure what Cause thinks about this, that the council agreed that we need more study, including maybe some kind of economic expert study of what the appropriate caps would be, in the context that the council, 4-3 at least, favors some kind of cap as an ultimate goal. And so various arguments came up there, which maybe we could talk about, because I think this is a helpful conversation to have, because I've been thinking a lot about these arguments. So should I just proceed in my
let me just
style?
Yeah, let me just interject a little bit, you know, and I remember those days when you had the room packed and they'd open room 15 and you could look at people and you could see the eye rolling and you could sort of see who was on what side, and it created for more of a dynamic and energetic sort of feel. And on Zoom, yeah, it's a different sort of experience. It's hard to separate the issue from Kathy Murillo. So that's, I think, what I wanted to maybe talk to you about after you answer a couple questions. But, you know, I think that's the thing here. It's that it's tied to politics. So it's easy to say for the critics, this is just Kathy at the last minute trying to do something to have a legacy or to mess with her opponents politically, when yes, Kristen Sneddon and Megan Harmon, they had that memo a little more than a year ago, and then it kind of disappeared. It was like gone. It was there, and never, you know, nothing came up. So I think that's part of it too. But the core issue here, let's separate the politics of Kathy Murillo of it. And yeah, just, you know, talk to me about some of the arguments. The landlords say, hey, if I'm small, if I'm a mom and pop and I just own a couple of apartments or something, I'm going to have to sell, and you're going to get these out-of-town investors who come in. I won't be able to make repairs I won't be able to do maintenance. You know, you hear these issues that ultimately this is bad for the tenant. So can you talk about that from your perspective?
I would, you know, maybe we need more data. I don't think so, because I think it's kind of absurd. I heard people say, I never raise my rent, so why is this happening? Well, if they don't raise their rent, why are they complaining about it? This is directed at the fact that there are tenants experiencing very large rent increases, because we have a zero vacancy market, and landlords, many of them, want to charge what the market will bear. And if this tenant can't pay it, someone else will come in who will pay it. It's amazing how many people are bidding up, when they're buying housing, bidding up beyond the asking price in order to get housing in this very tight and very competitive market. So the way I look at the rent control issue in this point in history is simply to put some restraint on all of that, because, and this is to me, this is the fundamental point what I'm about to say. It is not the case that this is an ordinary business transaction. Nobody who lives in a rental apartment for any length of time thinks, oh, I'm just doing business in having this apartment. This is the home. This is my resting place. This is my haven. This is where I make my life. And so there's a deep emotional attachment that most renters, I was raised in New York, we were renters all my life, believe it's their home, and it is their home. So to simply say it's a contractual relationship and the market should determine these things doesn't make sense to tenants ever, I don't think. And then from a practical point of view, I'm a homeowner. In fact, I have a rental apartment. I rent to people nowadays who I know because I am alone in this house. So I want to have somebody there that can be, sort of a companion in some way. But I make repairs. I don't need my rental money to pay for the repairs. I put it on my credit card. I can get, home equity loans for putting in, various kinds of things, a new furnace or roofing repairs. I don't understand how this argument even makes sense. The rents are high, and they've been able to, if the rents they're charging now enable them to make those, do what they need to keep up the place. It seems to me people, in ordinary daily life, we know that it isn't the rents that are paying for those. They can be helpful, of course, but they're not fundamental. And neither is the value of the property dependent on, or the profit or the gain that the landlord's making isn't simply dependent on the rents. I don't want to deny that there are people who might really be dependent on rents to make their livelihood. And a 2% cap plus the cost of living probably allows for more rent increases than they might normally provide. So I think those arguments shouldn't be just determinative of how members of the council or members of the public feel about the value of the issue. We need to really examine those claims. Now, the other kind of claim is the economist claim. When you put rent controls on rental apartment, then you're disincentivizing the development of new rental housing. And that may well have been true in the history of rent control, but it's no longer legally possible for the city to put rent control on recently built housing. In fact, the state law requires that housing built less than 15 years ago cannot be covered by rent control anywhere in the state. And this bill, whenever it is going to happen, that the council will deal with, will take account of that. And there are even members of the council were raising the question of whether rent control could be a disincentive for developing new rental housing. And that's probably partly why they wanted to do some kind of study on this, because there's a crying need for much more development of rental housing that will be affordable. And is there the case that if you have a 30-year, mortgage on loan in order to develop a large rental housing project, 15 years may not be enough to protect that investment, but it's worth, examining that. I don't think that's an argument against the need for a rent cap at this point. We don't know what the situation in the world will be next year, let alone 15 years or 30 years down the line. And, you know, if someone wants to take the vacant Sears building and develop hundreds of units of rental housing, I would really think that would be great, and that should be encouraged. And I don't, you know, I doubt that rent control will be a barrier to that. But, you know, that was brought up and it needs to be dealt with as a topic. So the idea, and over again, the landlord lobbyists say rent control never works. And our new mayor, talking about mayors, he has said that over and over again in interviews. It doesn't ever work. I don't know what the foundation of that flat statement is, but that again, and I hope there'll be more debate. That's why it's good there's going to be some delay. There'll be a chance to really discuss this in the community. And there's a lot of, if you go online, there's a lot of research of various kinds and various levels of quality on this very question. I think it's, I'm not a big expert on this, but I think it's fair to say that rent control works for tenants who are living under rent control in keeping their housing more affordable than it would otherwise be. And there's good evidence that people who might feel they had to move out because of rising rents don't. In other words, there is more stability in neighborhoods covered by rent caps than in neighborhoods that are not. Is there a decline in the quality of upkeep of apartments? Maybe there's some research that shows there is a decline sometimes and not in other communities, not. Where I agree with the critics, and so does Cause, is rent control is not the solution for affordable housing. It is part of a program that is needed. And that's what I really wanted to talk about. Cause's agenda, they talk about community stabilization. They're talking about developing new housing. They certainly agree that the supply of affordable housing must be increased, and they've worked toward that end. They supported rezoning the AUD program downtown. They've lobbied in favor of policies that will expand the possibility of affordable housing to be built. The problem is all the conversation in this town and most of the country is restricted to how can we provide incentives to private developers to make affordable housing. And that's what doesn't work. There is not much chance for private developers to develop affordable housing on the scale that we can identify as needed. And the one thing that policies have done in LA and in Santa Barbara and other places, okay, you make you're building rental housing, you've got to set aside a percentage of those apartments for affordable rentals. That doesn't meet anywhere near the supply requirements that people recognize as needed. And what we have the example of what can do it, and that is the housing authority of this city, which is nationally known as a brilliantly creative enterprise that develops affordable housing with public subsidy. You can't rely on private developers looking for profit. The housing authority isn't looking for a profit. They're using whatever available resources, which are very meager in this country. And they've done these miraculous projects. And pretty much every month, they announce a new project that will house the homeless. They just broke ground on this project for 28 units of people, that will provide housing for very marginally affordable people who can't really afford housing, period, with I assume some services and so forth. This is what they do, and they're in a position. I mean, we're so blessed in this town by the fact that this enterprise has existed for all these years. It's something like 15% of the units in this town are public housing created by the housing authority. And the county housing authority, which my late wife, Mickey Flax, was a commissioner of, also very creative in the county. So are there sources of funding that will expand what the housing authority can do? They're constantly looking for those. The Build Back Better bill, which is sitting in Joe Manchin's pocket, would provide an unprecedented level of federal funding for housing, affordable housing. And it's sitting there stalemated. That I've been eager to see that come into being. One of the ways that we do know federal funds are used for housing is so-called Section 8 housing, which is a program that allows poor people to get a voucher that they can take to a landlord and say, rent me your place and you will rent it to me for only 30% of my income, but the federal voucher will allow you to be subsidized to the rent that you want to charge. It's really, Section 8 is a subsidy program for landlords to provide affordability. That's a pretty weak way of financing this, new rental apartments, but it's one way. And I think there's 3,000 people sitting on waiting lists with the Housing Authority for Section 8 vouchers. And that's a national fact. One of the main reasons for homelessness is that the Section 8 program covers a tiny fraction of those actually eligible by virtue of their income in this country for such vouchers. They can't get them. When they get a voucher, doesn't mean they're automatically able to get an apartment. In fact, it may be quite difficult, even though there are laws against discriminating against Section 8. There's certainly that. So, but Section 8 should be expanded. Everyone eligible for Section 8 should be able to get it. And
let me add something there for a second. When I hear the landlords say we don't increase the rents, I know from my own, family's experience, my mom has passed away, but, my father's still around and he rents. We rented our whole lives, and he lived in a little studio, and they raised the rent like $450 overnight, like 1 month to the next.
yeah,
And so he's already paying like at the time like $900 or something. This is a few years ago. Like, well, you can't absorb that, like that's too much, on his retirement or Social Security. And so then I got involved, and like, well, what are the options? So we went and got him a Section 8 voucher, and did that whole thing, and it took some time, and he was able to find a place that he could live with that voucher. But the landlord is whole. The landlord still gets their money. My father's no richer. There's this perception that these people are somehow richer because of the government, when nothing's going into their pocket. That's just like the landlord still gets to charge their market rate. It's just the rest of it comes from the government. So I know that landlords raise rent, not all of them, of course, and this was a mom and pop landlord. This was not somebody like a big chain. This is somebody who just owns a few apartments. It's almost as though those people kind of want to raise it more because they do own just fewer, whereas the big ones, they can absorb it, they can spread it out. So I do see that. I wanted to sort of, just talk to you. There's these horror stories that come up. They come up at the council, and you hear these people call in, and they always bring up San Francisco. And they always say, in San Francisco, you've got these rich people, you've got these attorneys, you've got these people who have means, who will not leave their apartment because it's rent controlled, even though they absolutely can afford to. And that's not what rent control should. It's not the type of person that should be benefiting from this kind of program. So you hear these stories like if you could just imagine, it's like this nightmare of people squatting in their rent controlled apartments. And that's what we're going to see here in Santa Barbara. Nobody's ever going to leave. And we're going to have all these rundown buildings because of it. Can you address sort of that? Is that a reality some places? Is it a fear? Is that something from the 80s or the 70s? I mean, what is that argument all about?
I think part of the argument is more New York than, I don't know much about San Francisco in this case, but New York had rent control. When I was growing up, rent control was a very strong provision in New York housing. And then after World War II, there was tremendous landlord pressure to modify the law. And but those, and still to this day, I think if you occupy a rent-controlled apartment, you keep it. It's kept under rent control. Yeah, so there's a lot of tremendous loopholes. I would say everyone. I guess the generalization would be in New York that rent control has not worked in many, many cases, and yet it still does protect large numbers of working class and middle income people who are longtime renters. And I guess what I was beginning to get at is what we need is what did develop in New York as a positive thing was nonprofit social housing. That means organizations, government and other organizations finding the financial capacity to develop large-scale rental apartment developments all throughout the city. That was a big thing after World War II. And in Europe, that was the primary way that people recovered from World War II was vast housing development, sponsored by the government or unions, for example, and other organizations getting in on the game of developing housing. In New York, my parents lived in a co-op housing project, which is a very beneficial thing. It's tenant run, and you don't you have the benefits of ownership from a tax point of view if you're a member of a co-op, but you can't sell your apartment on the market like a condo. When you leave the apartment, it goes back to the organization, to the community. And so the rents on that apartment are always below what the market would be. And there's large numbers of co-op housing in New York, but nowhere else in this country. So what's needed are means of financing that don't depend on profitability to exist. Yesterday, it was announced that in LA, a measure is about to be put on the ballot, if they can get the signatures, a coalition of groups. The measure puts a tax on so-called deed transfer, a tax on the transfer of ownership for any real estate deal above, I don't know whether, I think it's $5 million, a 2% tax on any real estate transaction above $5 million, and then a bigger tax on huge, like 40 million or whatever it was. So that's the measure that's going to be on the ballot. And they are saying, the backers of this, that this will be an important way of financing housing for homeless people and for other people who are desperately unable to, it's still for poor people. It's not workforce housing that it would said to be financing, but that's one measure. I've heard discussion in town here, and even I think Randy Rouse, somebody interviewed him that I saw, maybe it was you, and he said about a bond issue for housing locally, and I think he didn't completely dismiss that. That is something that I know Cause, among other organizations, wants to look into to see what can be done locally, not dependent on federal or state funding, to develop affordable housing in the community. That's an avenue that we should have started exploring this long ago as an avenue, because it doesn't depend on big housing programs on the national level, it's something that maybe we can do something about locally. But as we know, that, you know, the cost of building new housing with the land costs and everything else is problematic. In this town, the League of Women Voters is exploring what public land exists downtown or in the city that could be sites for housing development by the community. In other words, taking the land costs away from the problem, if you can. One example would be downtown parking lots. You can build above them, and this has been talked about. But I think the league they do these explorations downtown every couple of weeks, looking for these sites, and they're not just owned by the city. There's school sites, or there's you know, other publicly owned sites that could be places for housing development. So that's an important part of the process. Another part of the process that I don't understand why we can't do something about, and I hope that there's going to be more leadership toward this. Why are we planning housing within the city and not realize we've got a regional problem, that people who work in the city live outside of the city, that we've got the Nolita area, the whole Goleta Valley area, and then the city of Goleta. I think ultimately what we want is some kind of housing plan for socially supported housing that can stretch throughout the coast and maybe even countywide, so that the idea that we would just overcrowd the city, which is part of, I think, the NIMBY resistance to housing, may not be so much of an issue. There is zoned area in Nolita where hundreds of housing units could be developed. And maybe there are plans or people looking at this, but what I'm talking about is developing these new housing that's not dependent on private developer incentives. If you have to guarantee 5 or 10% return, you're not going to get affordable housing out of it. We see that from the AUD program. You're going to get maybe some workforce housing, in that a lot of people do work in town and they have 6-figure incomes, and even those people can't really afford, you know, market rents or the usual market rents. But the AUD higher density kinds of developments may be more affordable for them. But it wasn't a solution, and but it wasn't a bad thing to do. I just think it's not the answer, but it's. So you see what I'm saying? We need a comprehensive program, and it has to include financing and development that isn't dependent. And I'll add one other thing, because I'm very involved in this. There's been talk for years about employers developing employee housing. Very little of that was done. There was a great case when Cottage Hospital developed 150 or so units for their staff in town. That seemed like maybe the opening gun of what could be a long-term development in the community where major employers would be doing this. But that nothing followed from that within the city, even though every year the Coastal Housing Coalition, which is the organization of big employers, they have these conferences where people come and say, we need employer-sponsored housing. I've been to these over and over again. The architects come to those conferences and they lay out fascinating schemes for employers to develop new housing that can be designated for their employees. Nothing has happened on that. But except for the university and Westmont College, I think they've developed some housing. But UCSB and about 10 years ago, presented a long-range development plan, LRDP, that provided for 5,000 additional students to be added to the campus, and 1,800 faculty and staff would go along with that to serve. That was what was the projected growth of the campus in that plan. And what UCSB promised in 2010 was to develop housing. The UCSB would develop housing that would house all those people. 5,000 students, 1,800 faculty and staff and their families housed by the university. I helped form an organization, a coalition of environmental groups called SUN, Sustainable University Now. And we looked at their LRDP, and there were problems within it. So we had a period of negotiation with the UCSB administration to modify the LRDP to make sure it met community needs on energy, on water, on traffic, on all kinds of dimensions like that. And it's a legal agreement between SUN and UCSB, and the city of Goleta and the county as well have similar agreements. And housing is an important part of this. Well, the sad story is, as we now know from the Munger monstrosity, that so far the promised housing hasn't happened. It's supposed to be done by 2025, all that housing that I've just mentioned. SUN was enthusiastic about the LRDP precisely because of the housing promise, because this was a huge benefit to the community, to take a lot of people, to really expand the housing market in that way. UCSB builds employee housing, and it's below market rents that are built into the development. And the way we negotiated it, it didn't require that new faculty would move in there. Any faculty and any staff could be able to be part of the market for this new housing that was going to be built. So we at Goleta started this lawsuit against the university for this very reason, that there's been this non-compliance. The Munger project is part of the reason for the failure. When Munger dangled his $200 million, it really seemed to solve a big problem for the universities. How are we going to finance all this housing? Well, here's a gift. We don't have to even go into debt to start building this big dormitory project that we need to build, and that the plan provided for. But that plan, the LRDP, provides for five different sites for much smaller dormitory housing than what Munger was about. So they put all of that on the shelf in favor of a single gigantic, what turns out to be huge, gigantic, the biggest dormitory ever conceived. It's bigger than the Egyptian pyramid. It's like a gigantic thing. And the result, has been an international scandal about this project. And that's really, there's a perfect storm here, because the legislature pushed the UC system to admit many more students than had been planned. So we reached at UCSB the 5,000 increase 2 years ago. It's supposed to be reached by 2025. So this huge acceleration in the influx of students without the housing at all. They're added to the housing market. Many of them were. They're tripling up in the dorms in IV and in the apartments in IV and in the dorms. So not a good situation. And then, with COVID, nobody was here, so it seemed to provide a respite from the problem. But now, as we know, the problem is severe, and it isn't only in Santa Barbara. All the UC campuses, I think, have some housing crunch because of this acceleration in enrollment. Well, if UCSB were to fulfill these plans, it would be helpful to the whole region. That's my point.
Yeah.
And I'm saying this now because I think the legislature, as well as the campus and the system, UC system, have a responsibility now to facilitate, for example, the dormitory development. And I think Monique Limon is aware of this. I believe there are bills now in the legislature for a vastly increased state program to support higher education dormitory development. It's not expensive because it pays for itself, but you need a revolving fund. You need the financing to be available to enable these projects to get off the ground and not to be dependent on private financial sources, which have not worked. They've tried that and it has not worked to develop the housing needed. That's my story, Josh. Thanks for listening.
we got about 15 minutes. The conversation
Okay,
is just
sorry
flying by
to
here.
monopolize.
Let me ask you a couple of things. I can hear Sheila Lodge, not to single her out, but that group, that crowd, you've had these clashes with the preservationists over the years, and I want to hear what you have to say about it. Building on top of parking lots, identifying city-owned land to build housing and high-density housing. You know, you always hear, less so now than 15, 20 years ago, but you hear, if we do that, we'll ruin what makes Santa Barbara so special. If we have a whole bunch of high-density buildings, we're going to have more traffic and people are not going to want to come to Santa Barbara. People want to be able to see the ocean from the Riviera. People like their sight lines. Can you address that? It's probably not like one or the other, but certainly the community has to give a little bit here, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, demographically, the city has not grown. It has actually declined in population, I believe. When we came here, and Mickey and I were involved in the early 70s in the controlling growth movement here very much. She was very active in that. It was about the population growth of the city. It wasn't about density, it was about growth. Well, part of this idea of community stabilization is we're losing people. We're losing the whole workforce. We're losing the young people, not to mention minority, Latino and other minority people who are the workforce, who are a key part of the workforce. And that's bad for the community. It's bad for the environment. It's not the town that we know to have a bunch of wealthy second home. How many vacant apartments, how many vacant dwelling units are there in town because they're second homes that are not on the rental market? This to me is, dramatic and scary fact that in the midst of a zero vacancy rate for housing, there are vacant homes most of the year owned by very wealthy people. Is that what we want? No, I don't think Sheila Lodge wants that. That's one point. And so, and I don't think people are advocating, I haven't heard anyone advocate high-rise apartment building, but to the height limit. There was a charrette done by the architects on developing State Street, and they have some very lovely ideas about what kind of housing could be built right downtown on the parking lots and all that. But one of my answers to Sheila, and I've actually mentioned this to her, she talks about the small town atmosphere. So I live down here on Garden Street near Alice Keck Park, and walk around here. This is 100 years ago that a lot of this started. It's a very high density. I think there's densities on my street and other streets around here higher than anybody is proposing in the AUD area. Apartment buildings, yes, but also, multiple unit houses, duplexes, what we now call granny units, long-standing, multiple units on a particular piece of property. It's a very dense neighborhood, and it is the heart of the small town. This is the heart of Santa Barbara down here. Now, above a certain street, I guess Valerio, it's very much zoned for larger plots and single family housing, and it's more luxurious. But the heart of the town, the small town feel, I don't think anyone would think that living in this area is, too much urbanization. On the contrary, so I don't think the density argument is a good faith argument, and I'm really in agreement with some of the architects who push this point. You can have lovely, beautiful, and very human scale housing designed with high density. And that's what they've tried to show with their charrettes. And the housing authority, which Sheila appreciates, she's always says supports affordable housing. And there we do agree. In other words, if it's market housing, new market housing, we don't need it. We don't need it. Yeah. Therefore, that would be a sacrifice. It could be seen as a sacrifice to develop that kind of housing downtown. Sacrifice of whatever the environment that we now live in, that we enjoy. But affordable housing, well designed, is what we're about, what could be about as a community. I'm actually thinking of I'll say this publicly, asking Sheila whether she come out for rent control, because that would help influence the new mayor, since he seems to defer to her on many issues. And if she's for affordable housing, isn't rent control a necessary transitional step to keep the workforce and the community stable, while answers are found for the longer term in terms of making the community livable for all classes of people? That's, I guess, my remote conversation with Sheila Lodge. So we've actually touched on 3 mayors. Maybe any other mayors we want to bring up. I say that jokingly because I never understood, frankly, how much weight was being put on Kathy Murillo's leadership or lack of leadership. Mayors are not necessarily the key force in bringing about the kind of development that we're talking about. That's good. I mean, we want citizen action to be in control of things, not mayors. And so anyway, that's just my.
Yeah, I mean, we have a strong city manager, former government.
That's right, and that's right.
And everybody, I mean, we have such a high level of activism in Santa Barbara. Everybody thinks they know what's going on better than the person next to them. And it's easy to point at people and electeds when the truth is that Randy's going to come in and he's going to have his objectors really fast, just like Kathy did. And there's not going to be much he can do about anything either. I guess it's symbolic leadership that people want from the mayor.
Well, let me make one comment, Josh, on this, just as a personal thing. I'm an old guy. I'm very settled. I'm well taken care of financially. So I understand that people like me don't want change. I understand it in my own gut. I want to live the rest of my life in normal, calm, lovely, peaceful way. And that's where the what you call preservation is. I don't know if that's the best term. NIMBY, you got to stick with NIMBY. As you know, and that's my shorthand. I understand where this is psychologically coming from, but it can't govern the future. Too many young people's lives are at stake. Too many working people's lives are at stake. The character of the community is at stake. And Randy may want to govern with the slogan, bring back normality, or build, make Santa Barbara normal again, but normal isn't working anymore in that meaning of normal. And I'm not talking about super development. I'm talking, there is a good point that we can't build enough housing to house all of the people who work in the city. Although if we planned regionally and if we coupled it with public transportation kind of planning integral to the housing, I think we would redefine what the boundaries of the community are that we're talking about, and that would make sense. But it has to be affordable community across the board. I mean, what happens if everything in Goleta is rocketing? And there's got to be some regulation control. And I want to use this term because my dear departed wife really loved this term: social housing, rather than housing as a commodity, is what I'm advocating and what I think is building up as a political force in the community. And I hope Randy can be persuaded to understand that, even though he's a businessman who thinks business is the best measure of efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we miss Mickey Flax and her advocating at City Hall, and her role in the Planning Commission on the county. She made people listen. She didn't care about being necessarily fake or polite, overly polite. It's like, here's what we need to do, and you need to hear it. And if you don't like it, too bad. And I watched her do that. She did that to me as a reporter. She's just blunt. And
so one other thing there on that point. So I had to listen to her too, and it was my pleasure for 60 years. My son, Chuck Flax, who is also a housing advocate, and he's actually working for the LA Homeless Agency right now, but he lives in town. We've set up the Mickey Flax Social Housing Fund in the Fund for Santa Barbara. It's a fund within the Fund for Santa Barbara. That's like everything the Fund for Santa Barbara does. It will provide grants, seed money kind of grants for people who want to develop social housing in this community. I don't mean the actual housing development, but advocate for, or maybe people want to create housing co-ops, which she loved. Mickey very much loved that idea. So that's one way we're continuing the legacy that you're talking about. Mickey Flax Social Housing Fund. Go to this Fund for Santa Barbara website and you can find it there. And if you want end of year giving, go do it. Thanks.
All
Thanks
right.
for the commercial time. Yeah, right.
Dick, that's a great spot to end. I really appreciate your time and you explaining these issues so eloquently. I had a great time sort of just listening to these perspectives, and you've outlined a whole platform. I hope the city council and the city administrator and the decision makers sort of, listen and maybe think about going with this multi-pronged regional approach. It's too bad the city didn't, I don't know if it's too bad, but annex. I think there was a time when they could have annexed more of the Eastern Goleta Valley, and they would have more control over that. I don't know the politics of all that, but you make a good point. It's a regional issue. It's a local issue. It's a regional issue. It's multi-pronged. And we get caught up on individuals and politics when really it's much bigger than that.
Josh, I appreciate not only the chance to be on here, but I appreciate you guys, the handful of people, Josh, you and Nick Welsh and others in the community who are keeping alive, in-depth, intelligent journalism for the community. This is a huge national problem as well as local, of the decline of, local journalism. So I know you're working probably harder than you want to work, but it's a great service. And doing this podcast, I hope that, I also have my own podcast. I'm trying to use this form is I hope a creative effort, and I hope people are listening to it. And so, and I will do more listening to it than I have now that I've been a guest.
Yeah. You
Anyway,
don't want to get me started on the state of journalism. I mean, that's just
I know.
so depressing and sad. And, I really like Nick Welch is amazing. And, Jerry and like, we remember stuff that happened more than 5 years ago, and that's really important when you're trying to understand the future. You got to understand, like, how did we get to this point? You mentioned that you have a UCSB weekly radio show, The Culture of Protests. Is that correct?
Yes, it's on.
When's that on? When can I hear that? When can people hear that?
Thursdays at 4 is when it's on the radio. And you can, there's a website, kcsb.org, that also you can tune into it. If I'll put you on my mailing list, but if anyone's interested, they can send me a email to rflax@gmail.com to get on my mailing list for the program, because there's ways to access it when it's not on the air. There's an archive that allows you to access it. There are fans of this program, so I must be doing something good. But for me, it's been a great learning experience for decades of the kinds of music that has developed historically and now all over the world that deal with social change and movements and political expression. That's what I do every week. And I even have a Christmas show that I've done for 40 years. That'll be on next week. Protest Christmas music. Okay. So thanks for that plug. And I'll plug one more thing, since we talked about in journalism. The Independent asked if they could create a fund in Mickey's name. So there's a Mickey Flax Fund for Social Justice Journalism that is housed under SB Can's website. People can donate there. And we have a little committee independent of the Independent that evaluates proposals that come for, again, stipends or bits of support, so that there can be some in-depth journalistic efforts in the community housed at the Independent. I worked for a while with a bunch of people thinking we could bring into being such an entity, and it for various reasons fell through. But this, on a much smaller scale, is doing something that we're glad. And I was really stoked by the fact that they wanted to name it for Mickey. So that's maybe confusing, but they're two separate Mickey Flax.
And do you have to work for the Independent to apply for these funds?
Ask Brandy.
Okay.
I mean, that's a good question. If you have an idea, I don't think I should encourage this publicly, because we don't know.
Fine.
But it could be that such a proposal could be considered.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That sounds like an excellent program, and I've seen some of the work that has come out of that, and that's great. Good for you. We need more of that, and we actually, as journalists, we just all need to work together, because the idea that we're like in Chicago and in the 80s and we're competing with like scoop like that's gone, because we all need to work together, even for different organizations, because like there's such a small pool. We need to just do the best journalism we can and support each other. So I think that's a good thing.
Oh, there was a model a few years ago that I don't know what happened to it, of having collaborative local journalism, where you'd have a TV news department, maybe a public radio news department, maybe the journalism department of a university and a newspaper, all collaborating on, with certain amount of open source reporting, I guess, and sharing of stuff. I don't know whether that model has actually worked. I think there was an effort in the Bay Area to do that. And the thing that I was referring to, we don't have time to get into it. was an effort to imagine that we could do something like that here in Santa Barbara.
We're not going to get into Michigan State. That's five hours of
Michigan
podcast.
State was the outcome of that,
Right.
and it was not a good idea.